We'd like to acknowledge the Ganyangahaga people on whose traditional unceded territory the institutions sponsoring this virtual conference are located, here in Jajage, also known as Montreal, where the work that we will present today has taken place over the last 4 years. Oops, pardon me. Okay. This presentation is part of an evolving reflection on the Circle Visions project, which was initiated in 2016 by Liz Miller and myself. I'm first going to introduce the Circle Visions project, then hand over the discussion to Liz Miller and Karine Pinette-Fontaine, who is a filmmaker and a recent participant in this initiative. The main component of Circle Visions is a series of cross-platform media making workshops for emerging Indigenous video artists held annually in the communications department at Concordia. These workshops invite participants from several Indigenous communities to take part in animation, experimental video, documentary, and other media workshops where they create short video artworks. More recently, these sessions have tended to focus on 360-degree filmmaking. The initiative has also involved Indigenous and non-Indigenous mentors and guest instructors, undergraduate and graduate students, and faculty from across Concordia's departments of First People Studies, Cinema, Communication Studies, Design and Computation Arts, Journalism, Applied Human Sciences, and Art Education. Circle Visions is centered around a core collaboration with Wapikoni Mobile, which is a unique film production studio aimed at Indigenous youth. Wapikoni has converted 4 recreational vehicles into mobile film studios that make month-long stops in various communities, enabling emerging Indigenous artists to conceive, produce, edit, and exhibit their own films. In collaboration with Wapikoni, Circle Visions brings together small groups of participant artists into our works. First part of the presentation considers some ongoing questions that have surfaced in parallel with this collaborative work. We appreciate any feedback you may have regarding this project and its implications. Given the emphasis placed on mobility by Wapikoni, we hope to elaborate and gain further clarity on a concept that we are currently calling critical transportability, which we envision as a process of questioning the desire for and approaches to travel in a virtual environment, including the power dynamics around fantasies or justifications for travel and the ways in which travel might be connected to forms of domination. As settler scholars, teachers, and media makers, one of our goals is to position ourselves in opposition to what Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai-Smith has described as traveler's tales, or stories by settlers that create exoticized and inaccurate Western views of Indigenous peoples. Before the foundation of Circle Visions, my own research found that Wapikoni challenges Quebecois and Canadian national myths constructed around transportation by facilitating the production of counter-narratives by a growing network of Indigenous filmmakers. Wapikoni reimagines transportation by encouraging intergenerational mobility between youth and elders, by facilitating the flow of Indigenous authored stories to non-Indigenous viewers, and by creating opportunities for travel and connections between members of different Indigenous communities through its global and local networks. It thus opposes colonial structures that have historically tried to limit Indigenous mobility. Building on these principles, the Circle Visions project looks to create additional and complementary spaces for Indigenous-led stories. At the current moment, we are trying to evaluate the usefulness of VR to support anti-colonial efforts. In spite of the enthusiasm VR technologies have generated about their alleged capacity for quote-unquote transformative empathy, as well as the industry's promotion of virtual travel that emphasizes being there and social presence, critics such as Lisa Nakamura have denounced what she calls toxic empathy, or the VR industry's promotion of its own inherent ability to fight negative attitudes and discrimination through, quote unquote, digitally mediated compassion, while neglecting structural injustice. Similarly, Alfio Leota and Miriam Ross criticize VR developers for reinforcing the tourist gaze at the expense of relationships, while Courtney Morin highlights issues of access and the lack of cultural and gender diversity in digital media studies and industry. Prior to this, an influential article published in 1996, in an influential article published in 1996, Métis Cree filmmaker Loretta Todd had already prompted reflection on whether cyberspace is compatible with Indigenous worldviews, given that in seeking knowledge, Indigenous cultures don't separate ideas from the world, nor do they separate the body from the mind in a Western Platonic or Cartesian sense. Nevertheless, most of these commentators, including Nakamura, point to positive applications of VR in Indigenous contexts. Indeed, since VR is still at an experimental stage of its history, it seems to present an opportunity for Indigenous filmmakers to shape its formal and narrative directions. Jason Edward Lewis, for example, has come to view the separation of Indigenous new media practice from the mainstream as an advantage that ensures the establishment of specifically Indigenous critical frameworks and distinct Indigenous futures that are not tied to mainstream models. Similarly, Keziah Wallace and Miriam Ross have applied the concept of Indigenous or fourth cinema, developed by Maori filmmaker Barry Barkley, to VR technologies and coined the term fourth VR. Wallace and Ross are currently mapping Indigenous VR productions worldwide, and their research suggests that many Indigenous VR makers have radically adapted this technology for their own cultural and political objectives, which often stress community, relations across time, and interconnections between all beings. Likewise, in founding the IM4 Indigenous VR Lab in Vancouver, Loretta Todd has based its work on Indigenous values, especially acknowledging the important role of Indigenous women. Todd warns, however, that Indigenous perspectives recognize the interconnection of all life, and that this is opposed to the idea of escapism or being disconnected from the material world. Shape-shifting in Indigenous worldviews is not simply for the thrill of a new body, she says. It is for healing. Taking these ideas into consideration, and before turning you over to Karen to talk about her film, I want to briefly mention some of the other 360 films produced in the Circle Visions workshops. In both Metaperotin by Melina Kitishnikwe and Full Circle by Craig Commanda and Naomi Kondo, the viewer is not expected to forget their own body. The Indigenous narrator is visible and present, speaking in the first person, and implicitly invite into a space that they occupy. But we're not encouraged to find ways to, but we are encouraged to find ways to experience our own interconnectedness with this environment. These films emphasize healing and links with elders, traditions, the natural world, and other beings. While sharing a personal experience, they don't enable escapism or satisfy a voyeuristic desire to temporarily become the Indigenous narrator. As the title of Full Circle highlights, the end point of travel is not a distant geographical space, but brings attention to the starting point, where the viewer is encouraged to reflect on their own presence and relationship to life. So this is merely a short summary of the work that Circle Visions has tried to support so far. We welcome your thoughts on this process and your suggestions of possible ways forward. But before this, I would like to hand the discussion over to my colleague Liz Miller and to Karen Pinette-Fontaine, who was one of the recent participants in the Circle Visions workshops.
Kester, can you actually just play the clip?
Yeah.
Karen's clip. We'll just start with a 1-minute clip. And as you're doing that, or is it all set up?
It is, yep. I'll do
Okay.
that now. Did you want to say anything first, Liz? Or
no, let's watch it.
Okay.
Mot du jour. Mishtuk, Mussin, Inapui. Over. Jour 55. J'y pense et c'est un peu ridicule qu'une invention coloniale me serve de preuve que je suis Inou. Je me servais du fait que j'ai grandi dans une réserve pour renforcer, même prouver mon identité. La réserve était un bouclier, je l'ai perdu. Maintenant, je vis en ville, je parle pas ma langue et je connais plus ma culture. Je sais plus qui je suis. Mot du jour. Inamnan, Anushkan, Uteimanan. Over.
Okay, over to you, Liz.
Okay, thanks. And can you pull up the script again as we're talking?
Sure, of course.
So thank you, Kester, for setting that up. And I just want to take a minute and introduce Karen. Karen Pinette-Fontaine of the Innu Nation has been making films since 2016 and has never afraid to take on complex issues. Her first film, Battles, addresses addiction, friendship, and Indigenous resurgence. This film, Langue Leçon, or Language Lessons, that she made in the summer workshop, was programmed by South by Southwest in Texas and was just screened last week at Imagine Native. Karen is a filmmaker, a musician, and a full-time student, and I want to thank Karen for making time to be with us today. So I want to just sort of look at this script together and Karen, ask you if you might speak to this theme of language resurgence. Making the film was, in a sense, a language lesson in itself, but you also create a story world of language where we're surrounded by words and where we're moving through a space that transforms itself as you walk through the space. Both you and the user are surrounded by words. So can you talk a bit about how you came to this theme?
Au début du workshop, je voulais vraiment faire comme un court-métrage vraiment pour les enfants, pour qu'ils apprennent avec l'utilisation du VR, d'apprendre des mots en Inoimun, qui est ma langue initiale, on va dire. Mais au final, genre, plus on avançait dans ce court-métrage-là, plus ça commençait à être plus personnel et tout. Et à la fin, ça a fait que ça a plus un sujet sur comment je vois comment c'est être une femme Innu dans la ville quand tu n'es pas entourée de ta langue, de la communauté où tu as grandi, dans la culture Innu aussi, où tu es un peu laissé sur toi-même dans cet environnement-là. Et je voulais faire un peu dire qu'on est entouré où j'essaie de réapprendre ma culture dans la ville en apprenant des mots dans ma langue avec des objets modernes et tout, là, comme comme l'autobus et tout, là, plein de choses comme ça qui ne fait pas vraiment, qui n'existait pas avant dans ma langue et tout. Donc, et que on a, et qui ont été inventés pendant comme il y a pas longtemps, on va dire.
Shall I translate, Liz?
Yeah.
Should I? I just wanted to translate that Karen was saying that when she started to make the film, she wanted to make a short VR piece. Her intention was to make a short VR piece to teach Innu children the Innu language. But as the project moved forward, it became more personal, and it became more about how it is to be an Innu woman, and when you're in the city and not surrounded by your language, and not surrounded by your community, etc., and left alone in that urban environment. And it became about trying to learn her language by applying it to modern, contemporary urban objects. I hope I translated that correctly, Karen.
Yeah, perfect.
That was amazing. And I just want to say one thing. I want to keep to our 20 minutes because there's so many people in the session, and I know people will have a chance to come back and ask Karen their own questions, I hope. But I wanted to just flag the fact that in addition to being engaged in this process of co-creation, we also are really excited to think through how VR might be used strategically in classrooms, both in Karen's community, but also with settler youth. And so Emily Trudeau, who worked very intensely, she's an MA student in communication studies, who wanted to be here, who worked very closely with Karen, is also taking this film into classrooms with Quebec youth, white settler youth, and thinking about their own relationship to language. And so a lot of our discussion has been about the immersive nature of VR, but we're also really interested in what happens before and what happens after you take off the VR headset. And so I'll just kind of flag that as these different co-creation processes. And also just mention that the moment that we made this film was a kind of key moment in technology, where a lot of the tools were suddenly becoming accessible. So we made the films with GoPros, we made it with open source software to create the kind of immersive sound environment that Karen is creating. And so we were really deeply thinking through these questions of access and kind of projecting, the next generation that Karen and that Emily and all of us might engage future youth, especially youth from Karen's community. So thank you. We'll be back for questions.